Hey, welcome to our channel. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss our latest content.
Tuesday. I've always had a complicated relationship with Tuesdays. They lack the fresh start optimism of a Monday and the weary relief of a Friday. They are simply the heart of the grind, a day of unremarkable persistence. But this Tuesday, the 14th of October, would etch itself into my memory with the searing permanence of a brand. I left the office an hour earlier than usual. A project had wrapped up ahead of schedule, a rare and satisfying victory in the world of structural engineering, where deadlines are less like finish lines and more like ever-receding horizons. Driving home, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in weeks. I pictured the evening, the chaotic symphony of our two daughters, Lily and Maya, recounting their school day, the familiar dance with my wife, Emily, in the kitchen as we prepared dinner, the eventual quiet descent of the house into sleep, a predictable movie, as she used to call it. But tonight, I craved that predictability. It was the bedrock on which our life was built. The moment I turned the key in the lock, however, the feeling of lightness began to evaporate. The house was too quiet. Usually, my arrival was met with a stampede of small feet and a barrage of unintelligible, excited chatter. Today, there was only the low hum of the refrigerator. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "In here," Emily's voice floated down from upstairs. It was a single, clipped response, stripped of its usual warmth. I dropped my briefcase by the door and took the stairs two at a time, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I found her in our bedroom, sitting before the vanity mirror. She was brushing her hair, long and dark, the same hair that had captivated me on our first date, but the motion was mechanical, her eyes fixed on her own reflection with an intensity that wasn't about vanity. It was the look of someone trying to solve a complex equation inside their own head. "Hey," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Quiet house, where are the girls?" "At my mom's," she replied, not turning to look at me. "She offered to take them for a sleepover. I thought we could use a quiet night." My mind immediately cataloged the possibilities. A quiet night was usually a good thing, a chance to reconnect. But the atmosphere in the room felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. This wasn't the comfortable silence of two people who know each other inside and out. This was the oppressive silence that precedes a storm. I walked over and sat in the worn leather armchair by the bed, my usual spot. I watched her reflection in the mirror. The simple act of her brushing her hair suddenly seemed fraught with meaning. Each stroke was deliberate, slow, as if she were buying time. I had always considered her beautiful, even on the most ordinary of days. But tonight, there was a fragility to her, a weight on her shoulders that curved her posture ever so slightly. Her eyes, usually so expressive, were guarded, wandering from her own reflection to the corners of the room as if searching for an escape route or perhaps the courage to stay. "Tough day at work?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She stopped brushing and set the brush down with a soft click. "You could say that." I waited. The silence stretched, thin and taut. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the bedside table, each second a hammer blow against the quiet. I knew this landscape. I had navigated the terrain of her moods for 12 years. I knew the difference between the weariness of a demanding job and the deep, internal turmoil that was brewing now. This was different. This was foundational. Finally, she took a deep, shuddering breath, her reflection's shoulders rising and falling. She slowly swiveled in her chair to face me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her expression one of profound, agonizing resolve. "Daniel," she began, and the sound of my own name on her lips felt alien. "I need to tell you something." The words dropped into the room like stones into a still pond, the ripples spreading out instantly, altering everything. I felt a cold dread wash over me. I've always been a rational man, a man who deals in physics, in stress points and load-bearing walls. I build things to last. But in that moment, I felt the ground beneath my own life begin to shift, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever she said next would test the very foundations of everything I had ever built. I simply nodded, bracing myself for the impact. "It's about work," she started, her gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "There's someone new in the marketing department." On my floor, I waited, my body rigid in the armchair. This preamble was worse than a direct hit. It was the slow, agonizing whistle of an incoming shell. "His name is Ethan Foster." The name meant nothing to me for a split second. It was just a name. Foster. And then, the connection sparked in the recesses of my memory, a file buried deep, locked away for over a decade. Ethan Foster. Her ex-fiancé. The man she was with before me. The man who had nearly been the father of the daughters sleeping peacefully at their grandmother's house, oblivious to the fault line cracking open in their own home. He was a ghost, a character from a story she had told me long ago, a story I had believed was finished, its final chapter written. And suddenly, he was here, not a ghost, but a man of flesh and blood, working on the same floor. I kept my expression neutral. It's a defense mechanism I learned early in my career. When a structure is under stress, you don't panic, you assess, you calculate. Outward calm is paramount. Inside, however, a controlled demolition was underway. "Okay," I said, my voice a low, steady murmur. And the single word seemed to grant her permission to continue. The details came out in a rush, a torrent she'd clearly been holding back. "He started a few months ago. I didn't know how to tell you. At first, it was just seeing him in the hallway. Then, in the elevator, he asked me to lunch, just to catch up, as friends." Each detail was a small, sharp blow. The same elevators, occasional lunches, hallway conversations, laughter in the cafeteria. She was pouring it all out like someone trying to empty a glass of water slowly to soften the splash. But the glass was already overflowing, spilling onto the life we had so carefully constructed. My jaw was clenched so tight my teeth ached. My body was a statue, but inside my mind was a maelstrom of images. Emily laughing with another man, a man who had known her intimately before I did, a man whose history with her was a book I could never fully read. "I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd be uncomfortable," she continued, her voice pleading now, and honestly, I was still trying to figure out my own feelings about it. It was just so strange, seeing him again, after all this time. I cut through the excuses, my voice sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. It was the only way I could maintain control. I needed a fact, a single, verifiable data point in a sea of emotional chaos. "Have you two met up outside of work?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. She hesitated. It was only for a second, a fleeting, almost imperceptible pause. But in that single second, a universe of possibilities collapsed into one, damning certainty. In that second, I knew the answer. The silence was her confession. The flicker of her eyes, the way her breath hitched it was all the confirmation I needed. The ground wasn't just shifting anymore. It was cracking wide open, a chasm forming right there in the middle of our bedroom. "Yes," she finally whispered, the word barely audible. "We've had lunch a few times. That's all." Two words meant to reassure, but they landed like an insult. I simply looked down at my hands, resting on the arms of the chair. I studied the lines on my palms, the calluses on my fingers from years of work, of building, of providing, hands that had held her, that had held our newborn daughters, that had fixed leaky faucets and built bunk beds. They suddenly felt like the hands of a stranger. Nothing more needed to be said. The truth, or at least a version of it, had settled between us, as cold and hard as an ice wall. What Emily didn't know was that her confession wasn't entirely new information. It was a confirmation. A few weeks ago, my assistant, Laura, had mentioned something. Laura had been with my firm for 8 years. She was fiercely loyal, efficient, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read situations. She had come to me, her expression troubled, to discuss a scheduling matter, and then she'd paused. "Daniel," she'd said, choosing her words with care, "this is probably nothing, and please tell me if I'm out of line, but I saw Emily the other day at lunch. At the Clove, she was with a man. They seemed very engrossed in their conversation. I only mention it because you'd said she was swamped with the Henderson project, and was eating at her desk all week. At the time, I dismissed it. Emily had friends, colleagues. It was nothing." But Laura's warning had planted a seed of unease. Laura wasn't a gossip. She was a protector. She saw me as a good man who deserved a heads up. Now, with the confirmation coming from my wife's own lips, everything clicked into place. The long lunch breaks, Emily staying late at the office more often, blaming the Henderson project. Doubt, a corrosive acid, had turned into certainty. I tasted something bitter in my mouth. It was the flavor of suspicion, an element that had never, not once, existed in the ecosystem of our marriage. Emily kept talking, her words tumbling out, trying to explain the unexplainable. "Nothing serious happened, Daniel. I swear, it was just innocent. We were just talking about the past, about how different our lives are now. But the damage was already done. Once trust fractures, it doesn't matter if the cause was a magnitude 9 earthquake or a small, hairline crack from a settling foundation. The crack is there. It is visible. And that's what I saw in her eyes now. The reflection of a disturbance, a fundamental instability capable of threatening the entire structure we had spent 12 years building. Slowly, my body feeling like it was moving through water, I pushed myself up from the armchair. I walked to the bedroom window and stared out at the dark street. Outside, the world was calm. Parked cars gleamed under the orange glow of the streetlights. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree in our front yard. It was a picture of serene, suburban peace. But inside this house, inside this room, something essential had broken. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her. I didn't judge. I just turned back to her, my voice steady, devoid of the inferno raging inside me. "You should have told me sooner, Emily." Then, silence. A profound, uncomfortable silence. Heavy with everything left unsaid, with the ghost of another man, and with the fresh corpse of the absolute trust I once had in her. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. It wasn't just Ethan who had returned. It was the specter of a life she might have had, and it had surfaced to test the strength of the life she had chosen with me. And the worst feeling of all, a cold dread that settled deep in my bones, was the feeling that this was only the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. After Emily, exhausted by her tears and confessions, finally lay down and turned her back to me, I remained by the window. For a long time, I stood there, motionless, arms crossed, my eyes lost in the inky blackness of the backyard. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, and the world outside seemed to be holding its breath along with me. Each thought was like a wave in a relentless flood, invading my mind without invitation. It wasn't jealousy I felt, not in the simple, hot-headed way. It was something deeper, more painful. It was the feeling of profound betrayal, not of the body, but of the sanctum. The woman I shared my life with, my dreams, my home, the mother of my children. She had opened a door, just a crack, to a part of her life that was supposed to be sealed. And through that crack, everything I had never imagined facing was now slipping in. Doubt, insecurity, the ghost of another man's claim on her past. After an hour, or maybe it was 2, I moved from the window and sat back down in the armchair. The leather groaned softly under my weight. I looked at Emily's form under the covers, her back still turned to me. She seemed to be sleeping, but I knew she wasn't. The tension in her body, even in stillness, was palpable. She was fighting her own battle, lost in her own labyrinth of regret and confusion. And maybe that was the hardest part. There was no clear villain here. There was no single, unforgivable act. There was only distance. A silent rupture, like a crack that starts deep inside a concrete wall, invisible on the surface until stress is applied, and then it's suddenly too late. During those long, dark hours, my mind replayed our life together. I saw it all in stark, painful clarity. I remembered the day I proposed to her, kneeling on a wooden dock at a small lake as the sun set behind me, turning the water to liquid fire. I remembered her shock, then the tears of joy, the way she'd thrown her arms around me, yes, a breathless whisper against my ear. I remembered the terror and elation when we found out she was pregnant with Lily, the grainy, black and white ultrasound image, and the sound of that tiny, impossibly fast heartbeat, a sound that I had thought was the percussion to the rest of our lives. I recalled the sleepless nights, walking a colicky newborn around this very room, Emily and I passing our daughter back and forth like a fragile, precious baton, our exhaustion, a shared language, the Sunday mornings with improvised pancake breakfasts, flour dusting Maya's hair. The lean years when we barely had money for a date night but always felt rich because we had each other. And now I wasn't sure what we had. Not because she had done something unforgivable, at least, not in the conventional sense, but because she had allowed another man to occupy a mental and emotional space that was meant only for the two of us. And that changed everything. Trust, respect, my very identity as her husband, it all felt compromised. I have always been a calm man. It's my nature. But I also have firm principles, forged from a childhood where promises were often broken. There was a clear line inside me, a boundary that, once crossed, might have no path back. I'd always believed that love wasn't just a feeling, it was a daily choice. That loyalty wasn't just about fidelity of the body, but about emotionally protecting one another from the world, and from the ghosts of the past. And in that armchair, in the suffocating quiet of our bedroom, I felt completely and utterly unprotected. The woman sleeping just feet away, the center of my world, had momentarily forgotten to be my partner in that protection, and I didn't know if that was something I could ever forget. Dawn began to bleed into the sky, painting the horizon with bruised shades of purple and orange. I hadn't moved from the chair. My body ached with stillness, my mind with exhaustion. Quietly, I stood up and went downstairs to the kitchen. The house was cold. I boiled water, made coffee, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I automatically sliced 2 pieces of bread and put them in the toaster. I spread butter on them when they popped up, not because I was hungry, but because it was routine. It was a way to maintain some semblance of control over my world while the rest of it felt like it was spinning off its axis. Emily appeared a little while later, still in her pajamas, her eyes red and swollen. She walked into the kitchen slowly, cautiously, as if stepping onto uncertain ground. She looked lost in her own home. I placed a mug of coffee in front of her on the table without saying a word. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice hoarse. I didn't respond. I sat opposite her, the wooden table a vast, empty expanse between us. I took a deep breath, marshaling my thoughts. Then, I spoke. I didn't shout. I didn't point fingers. I didn't make a scene, but I spoke with the unyielding firmness of a man who had spent an entire night staring into the abyss and had decided exactly what he was, and was not willing to accept. "I won't fight for space against anyone's past, Emily," I began, my voice level and low. "I'm not the type of man to beg for attention or to compete for loyalty. If you want to keep in touch with Ethan, if there is still something you feel you need from him, then you should have the courage to see that through. But you won't do it while dragging me and our daughters into that hole with you." She tried to speak, to interject, but I gently raised a hand, asking her to wait. "I don't want explanations or assumptions anymore," I continued, my gaze unwavering. "I need actions. I need proof. So I'm going to lay my cards on the table. If you want to stay in this marriage, if you want to try to rebuild what you've put at risk, there are conditions. Not because I want to control you, but because it is the absolute minimum required to even begin." She listened in silence, her eyes filling with fresh tears, her fingers gripping the warm mug like it was the only thing keeping her anchored in the present. "First," I said, ticking the points off in my mind, "you will cut off all contact with Ethan. No messages, no emails, no lunches, no accidental hallway glances, no excuses, nothing. He becomes a ghost again. Second, you'll keep your phone's GPS on at all times. This isn't about irrational paranoia. It's about transparency. It's a temporary measure until trust can be re-earned. Third, you will start individual therapy. I need you to understand why you felt so vulnerable to someone who belongs in a closed chapter of your life. You need to understand it for yourself. Fourth, we will start couples therapy together, so we can both find our way back to each other, if there's a way back to be found." I paused, letting the weight of the word sink in. There was one last condition. "And finally, you will distance yourself from Chloe." Chloe. Her trendy, perpetually single friend who I was certain had been a toxic influence for years. "Frankly, Emily, she's been pouring gasoline on this fire while pretending to be your supportive confidant. I won't have that influence around our family anymore." When I finished, there was no scene, no yelling, no dramatic breakdown, just a heavy, profound silence, the kind that only happens when someone realizes they are facing their very last chance. I stood up from the table. I went to the hallway and grabbed the girls' backpacks from their hooks, preparing their snacks for when I would pick them up from my mother-in-law's. I gathered their coats. I didn't do this out of anger. I did it because that's who I have always been. A man of action, a present father, a husband who, even when deeply hurt, still felt the pull of his responsibilities. Before leaving, I stopped at the door and looked back at her, sitting small and broken at our kitchen table. "Think hard about what you want, Emily," I said, my voice softer now, tinged with a pain I could no longer completely hide. "Because you can't keep one foot in the past and one in the present. Eventually, you'll fall into the crack between them." Whoa. And then I left, closing the door softly behind me. The day passed in a blur of forced normalcy. At the firm, I immersed myself in blueprints and stress calculations, the clean, predictable logic of physics a welcome refuge from the emotional chaos of my life. My colleagues saw only the focused engineer, the calm leader. No one could see the chasm that had opened up beneath me. Only Laura seemed to notice. She brought me a coffee mid-morning, setting it on my desk without a word, her expression one of quiet, knowing sympathy. She didn't pry, but her gesture was clear. "I'm here." I gave her a small, grateful nod. It was a strange comfort, knowing that someone else had seen the first tremor before the earthquake hit. I left work early to pick up Lily and Maya. The moment I saw them, their faces lighting up as they ran towards me, my heart ached with a terrifying new vulnerability. They were the stakes. They were the innocent civilians in a war they didn't even know was being waged. In the car, their chatter about their sleepover, about grandma's cookies and grandpa's silly stories, was a beautiful, painful melody played over the discordant hum of my anxiety. What would I do if Emily chose wrong? How could I explain to these two bright, happy girls that their world was about to break apart? I took them for ice cream, delaying our return home. I needed more time. Or maybe I was afraid of what I would find when we got back. I watched them laugh, chocolate smeared on their faces, and I felt a fierce, protective love that was so powerful it was physically painful. I had built this life for them. I had built it with their mother. The thought of it all crumbling into dust because of a ghost from her past was unbearable. All day, my mind was a courtroom. Arguments were made for and against her. The prosecutor and me listed her deceptions, her secrecy, the betrayal of our shared intimacy. But the defense attorney, a quieter voice, spoke of 12 years of partnership, of her goodness, of the love that had been the bedrock of my adult life. Was one period of profound weakness, one foolish mistake, enough to destroy all of that? My ultimatum replayed in my head. Had I been too harsh? Too demanding? The thought flickered and died. My conditions weren't punishments. They were the necessary tools for reconstruction. You can't rebuild a bridge on a crumbling foundation. The ground had to be cleared, the weaknesses addressed, before we could even think about laying the first stone of a new trust. Driving back to the house, my hands were clammy on the steering wheel. The girls were quiet now, tired from their day. As I turned onto our street, I saw our house, the windows warm and inviting against the encroaching dusk. For a moment, it looked just as it always had, a sanctuary, a place of peace. But I knew it was now a crossroads. The choice she made today, alone in that house, would determine if it remained a home or became just a building where we used to live. I parked the car, took a deep breath, and prepared myself to face the verdict. The girls scrambled out of the car and ran for the front door, their backpacks bouncing. I followed more slowly, each step feeling heavy, deliberate. When I walked inside, the house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the night before. The oppressive tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, waiting stillness. Emily was standing in the living room. She had been crying, I could see it in the puffiness of her eyes, but she was composed. She greeted the girls with hugs and kisses, her voice a little shaky but full of love. She helped them take off their coats, her movements graceful and maternal, a painful reminder of the woman I had fallen in love with. After she sent the girls upstairs to play, she turned to me. The space between us in the hallway felt like a mile-wide canyon. She didn't offer excuses or platitude. She didn't try to minimize what had happened. Instead, she did something I never expected. She slowly approached me, and when she was standing before me, she knelt on the floor. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical gesture. It was a quiet act of complete and utter surrender, of profound humility. Tears began to stream down her face again as she looked up at me. "I'm here," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Not because you told me to be, but because I want to be. There is nowhere else I want to be." I didn't respond. I just looked down at her, my heart a tangled mess of pain, anger, and a flicker of something I hadn't dared to feel all day. Hope. My silence was not an accusation, it was an invitation, a space for her to fill, and she did, without drama, without exaggerated pleas. She told me everything. She said she had blocked Ethan's number, his email, all his social media. She had sent a final, brief message through the company's internal system stating that their contact was inappropriate and had to end immediately. She told me he was the past, and that she had made the terrible mistake of looking at him like he was a window to another life, when in reality, he was just a mirror reflecting a version of herself she no longer wanted to be. She talked about Chloe. She said she'd blocked her number, too. She admitted that for a long time, she had sought comfort in advice that only pulled her further away from the woman she had become beside me, the wife and mother she was proud to be. But the most powerful moment of her confession didn't come from her apologies for her actions. It came when she admitted, her voice cracking with shame, that she didn't have a clear explanation for what she had felt. It wasn't an affair of the heart, not really. It was a lapse, a mistake born in the dark corners of her own mind, in the exhaustion of routine, in a moment of profound weakness. A mistake she couldn't blame on anyone but herself. For the first time, she was completely vulnerable. No pride, no defensiveness. Just the raw, painful humility of someone who knows they have messed up badly, deeply, and might never be able to fully fix it. But even so, she wanted to try. She wanted to fight, not just because she feared losing her family, but because, as she put it, she had been painfully reminded of the immense value of what she had almost thrown away. I stayed silent for a long time, my eyes on her, but my thoughts were turning inward. I felt the ice around my heart begin to crack. Hearing her confess not just the mistake, but the confusion behind it, confirmed my worst fear. She had almost walked away, but in that same confession, I saw her returning. Hurt, yes. Regretful, yes. But she was coming back. Slowly, I leaned down and took her hands, helping her up from the floor. I led her to the sofa and had her sit beside me. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the silence between us was comforting. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because now there was space for a real conversation to begin. I didn't make promises. I didn't say it was all okay, because it wasn't. The pain was still fresh, and my trust still felt as fragile as spun glass. But I looked at her, truly looked at her, and said something she didn't expect to hear so soon. "I haven't given up yet, Emily." A wave of relief washed over her face, so powerful it was like watching her breathe for the first time in days. "But now," I continued, my voice firm but not unkind, "you're going to have to show me you won't give up either." That night, we slept in the same bed. We didn't touch much, not as a passionate couple, not pretending nothing had happened. We lay there like two survivors of an emotional shipwreck, close enough to feel each other's warmth amidst the wreckage. Just before she fell asleep, she began to cry softly, silently into her pillow. Without thinking, I reached for her hand under the blanket, my fingers lacing through hers. It was a small gesture, but for two people standing on opposite sides of a freshly formed chasm, it was the first thread of a new bridge. A quiet, painful, and above all, possible new beginning.